Welcome to Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg. We're here to explore the imposter syndrome that haunts creatives, delving into how it affects their lives and work. Join us as we chat with authors and artists about creativity, self-doubt, featuring imposter characters and their stories, and the occasional imposter who pops up in their day-to-day lives.
Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Meredith Maran to the show. Meredith is the activist author of a dozen books, a speaker on women and aging and sex, and a book critic, essayist for the Washington Post, the New York Times, O Magazine, and the Los Angeles Times. Meredith lives in a Los Angeles bungalow that's even older than she is, and with her person in Palm Springs. Welcome, Meredith.
Oh, it's so great to be here, you guys.
Oh, it's such a treat. And I just want to give the listeners out there some context of how we know each other and why this is such a special episode. We knew each other when I was a publicist in publishing. And, you know, I certainly pitched you many books, I think, over my years. But I got the special privilege to work with you when I was publicity director at Plume on an amazing anthology you put together and edited called Why We Write.
Mm-hmm.
And it was 20 writers talking about the craft and, as the title would suggest, why they write. And it was one of my fondest memories of working in the industry.
Aww.
And one of the treats was, you know, when we were you and I were brainstorming, like, how can we let people know about this book? It's an anthology. Anthologies don't generally get a lot of press.
Right.
But you had cultivated this like amazing stable of legendary writers, and you gave me a list. Here's all the emails. Here's all the phone numbers.
Yeah.
And I spent a day calling, you know, like Terry McMillan, who picked up the phone.
Yeah.
And as a closet writer myself, being able to call these legendary writers that I had always loved and be accepted and get to have these conversations about doing events, it was just awesome. So thank you for that.
Oh, it was so fun. Yeah. Well, I was actually on the phone with a writer friend last night, and per the usual, every 10 years, everybody's saying, we always thought it was bad, but it's never been this hard to be a published writer. And we were talking about actually having done that book and what it would be like to do an update now. You know, it's just such a different industry. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would love it if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, because I think this comes up so much. You know, maybe if you can give us some context, because you've been doing this a long time. And
I have. I published. Yeah, I'm 73. Let's get that out of the way. And no, I didn't reverse the numbers by accident, although it feels like that to me sometimes. I published a poem in Highlights for Kids when I was 5, and that got me rolling. I still really enjoy being in a room with people clapping. So anyway, that kind of gave me an idea of what it could be to be a writer. And I published my first book when I was 18, I think. And yeah, with my boyfriend, it was a book about being hippies going back to the land in Taos, New Mexico. And since then, I've published 14 books, and all of them nonfiction, with the exception of a novel that was published 2012, I think. And then my project right now, which we can talk about some more, is also a novel. And yes, and I have also been a book reviewer for probably 20 or so years, and I could count the years by the number of pages that each of these publications has cut from their books coverage. I wrote for People magazine when they had 12 pages a week. It's so incredible to think about that now. And the front page of People magazine, some of the friends I have who are writers are my friends because I reviewed them on the front page of that People section. And that was known to be, along with two other things, Oprah and Fresh Air, and the cover page of People magazine were the three things that sold books, actually moved product. And of course, none of those things exist anymore. Right. Well, Fresh Air does. Yes. I don't think it sells books the way it used to. But so being a reviewer has continually, through these different phases of publishing, has really given me some insights about definitely my finger on the pulse of what's happening now.
Yeah.
And were you, I'll say this as well, not having known you for as long as Liz, but I guess my first sort of exposure to you was through the Why We Write anthology, which Liz gifted me and which I read and really enjoyed. What was for where you were coming from at the time? What was the impetus for you to kind of put that together?
It's actually a great story. I one of several books that I wrote book proposals for and tried to convince my agent to sell. And I wanted to do, I'll keep this very short because the long and the short of this story is no one cared. I went to all this trouble to do this beautiful book proposal and my agent said, no one cares. And I couldn't believe it. And I kept revising it. And I finally actually got her to let me pitch it myself to some editors. And it was to be a sort of combined memoir histoire, as they say in French, a story, a biography of Françoise Sagan, who wrote Bonjour Tristesse, which is, see, like nobody's going, oh my God, how did nobody care about her? I just went to see a new film. There's the movie of Bonjour Tristesse was made in the 30s, I think, or 40s with Jean Seberg and so on. And so it was, anyway, it was the first book I read and the only book I could read from my parents' bookshelves. I'm not sure to this day how that book ended up on my parents' bookshelf. But continuing to revise this proposal and try to convince editors and my agent to let me do this book about the similarities between us. And my agent very wisely said to me finally, after 6 months of this, it's clear you can't let this go. What is it about this person that is you're so in this idea that you're so attached to? And I said, well, she made me a writer. Reading that book made me a writer. And she said, why don't you do a book about why people become writers? And she actually bribed me falsely by saying Françoise Sagan could be one of the writers. She didn't even know she was dead for like 50 years. That's how famous she was. Anyway, needless to say, there is no Françoise Sagan chapter in Why We Write, but doing the book actually, in a way, didn't satisfy the urge to write what I wanted to write, but it did definitely resonate with it. It caused me to look back at why I had started doing this, and it was such an incredible project. And then there was a second book in that series, Why We Write About Ourselves. And I am primarily a memoirist, or a hybrid memoirist and journalist. And so doing both of those books, each book causing me to interview 20, not like Françoise Sagan, household name writers who everybody had heard of, was really just one of the best projects I've ever done.
There's something about this story that I think segues really well into talking about your current project. And what I've known to be true about you is that you're incredibly, passionate about getting something to come together, getting it to work, getting something to sell. And I imagine, being both a writer and then a reviewer, having to pitch stories, but in particular, Meredith, I find that you really have like a stick-to-itiveness about you that I love. So can you, I'm kind of leading the witness, but can you tell the listeners how that relates to your current project?
Yes. So what I'm working on now, the last book I published was in 2017 called The New Old Me. And it was about turning 60, which seemed impossibly old at the time, and basically running away from my life, moving from Oakland to Los Angeles. And since I finished that book and published that book, I really have been impressed by, I very much pay attention to the mail that I get, or whatever it's now called, messages. And there were so many women who wrote to me. The book was in large part about a divorce, or it was sparked by a divorce from someone I thought I would never, ever be without. And I was really heartbroken. And as my best friend said at the time, I did my 20s and my 60s because I had been serially married, usually for 12 to 15 years at a time. And in the 10 years between divorcing my wife and becoming engaged to the person I'm now engaged to, I did a lot of sex. I did a lot of quote unquote dating, a lot of stooping, as we Jews call it. And I was so interested from that in women and sex. It just became not only a living obsession, but also a writing obsession. There's so many great women writers now writing about sex, not just about it, but in it. And so I wanted to write a book that was a nonfiction book about the arc of women's sexuality in America since I became sexual, which was in 1965. So I started working on it, and I had so many iterations, which is not like me. As you mentioned, I get an idea, I stick to it, I try to make it happen. And in this case, I was lucky enough to get 2 residencies the first summer I was working on it at McDowell and then Yaddo. And so that is such an advantage because you've got a ready audience. First of all, you're surrounded by people struggling with what you're struggling with all day. Right. And then you do readings, and, I got a lot of great feedback. That was in 2019. So that gives you an idea of how long this obsession has been going on. So I wrote it as a memoir, and a memoir / journalistic story, and worked on it a lot, got a lot of notes from my agent, wrote it again, and then we sent it out and nobody bought it. And we couldn't figure out what the letters were very connected. They weren't just like, doesn't fit our list, bye, don't darken my doorstep again. They were thoughtful rejections. And the other thing that had happened in the interim was that I had fallen in love for the first time in many, many years. And the person I had fallen in love with is gender non-binary. And this was 3 years ago or so. And so the end of the book changed. We decided to try for another submission and make some changes based on the rejection letters and also how my life had changed. So it changed from a book that was focused mostly on the 60s and how women's identities, sexuality, and then feminism all came together to create a really different sexuality for American women, including mine. And it changed. I had tacked on this last chapter of, the book had ended with me being a slut, basically, at the age of 65, and a happy slut, but one who was also then looking for a relationship. And then I met Denise, and so there was this end chapter. And when we sent it out a second time, or the first time, it didn't sell. And my agent I said, take 2 weeks. She was going to just send it out again. I said, no, something's missing here. Let's just take, and this is not me. I'm like wanting to do it before I even think of doing it, I said, take 2 weeks, go back and read it or skim through it again. And I think you'll see what I see that's missing. And she came back and said, the last chapter is the beginning of the book. I was like, what a great idea. I love that sentence. It was such a perfectly formed sentence. And then I thought, but I'm in the last chapter of the book. How do I write 300 pages starting now for a book proposal? And so at that point, it changed pretty dramatically, and started tilting toward the issue of gender, because I was having a really hard time. I had only been with feminine women. I identified as a feminine woman, and I had completely ruled like no butches for me. No. And this was based on when I came out in the 80s and what butches were like then. And so we sent it out again with this sort of tilt toward gender, but not fully that. And it didn't sell again, but this time the rejection letters were even better, like more frustrating. You know what that's like. It's like, just in a way, it's better to say it doesn't match our list, Right. But these were like page-long letters. And one of them from an editor who I'm hoping to pitch to again, said, what's most fascinating in this book is the idea that a woman of Meredith's age, who has identified as primarily as a feminist throughout her whole life, most of her life, is now having her feminism questioned. Feminism is about, I am woman, hear me roar. That was like the first turning point in my life. Like, oh, I'm a woman. That's a big thing. That's a big part of who I am. And I made it everything about who I am, including changing from being with men to being with women and all that. And she said, this is a fascinating thing for the whole culture. How does feminism fit with our new gender culture wars? And when it didn't sell the second time as a memoir, I took a bunch of time off. I knew that I needed some perspective. And then when I started to work on it again, I put all the rejection letters in front of me, and that one just popped out. And I thought, how nice of her to give me the next version. And I decided to write it as a novel, mostly because I just could not stomach writing it as a memoir again. And also because I wanted more freedom to emphasize what I wanted to emphasize. And actually, right before we got on the call, I sent 75 pages of the new version to my agent as a novel.
Wow.
And it's gone from the titling of the memoir was like, I barely have any friends left because I wore them all out. Like, what about this title? And it was so hard to title the memoir. And I think we ended up with Sex Pot, which, was about basically my sexual life story and how that matched up with the cultures. And now it's called They, Them, Me, Her. And it's really about my character's arc in being that is more told from the inside. Like, I've been a feminist all my life. I'm falling in love with this person who says I'm neither a woman nor a man. And I'm like, okay, this can't, then what am I if my lover is not a woman? And it's, there's drama in it, obviously, because it's a novel, but it's a very different, it's the same and different.
Wow. I have so many, Greg, you go. So many questions.
I'm doing a bit of rudimentary math in my head, but
yeah,
we mentioned earlier in that explanation that you were discovering your sexuality in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Just off the top of my head, I mean, this is the decade before the ERA was proposed, before women couldn't get a credit card without. So, and in some ways, I mean, it sounds like you've had this incredible journey where you've been able to discover yourself and your truth more as a queer woman, and all the generations ago.
Right.
It's occurring to me. I mean, not occurring to me now, but in the context of this conversation, we have very much done a full circle going back to where we are now politically and socially.
Exactly.
What has that? I just wonder what that experience or that journey has been like for you to be so kind of progressive with yourself and forward thinking and all of these things, and living within the framework of something that has really regressed almost where you were kind of coming into your own.
Right. I mean, the first thing my friends started saying to me, not in terms of my writing about this, but in terms of who I was, you've been in the front lines of the revolution since you were 15 years old, and now you're acting like a Republican. Because I was like, they, them doesn't work. I'm sorry. I can't butcher the language just for a little thing like a gender revolution. No, I was just being like, super stubborn and and in my own defense, I will say it was not just an emotional reaction, or a lot of writers have. I mean, it's the first time I had to write a book review, as it happens, was about then Jill Soloway, who had recently, the creator of Transparent, among other things. And I had to review their book, and I didn't know, and the publicist I said, I want to interview Jill while I'm, doing the review. And she said, well, they're out of the country. And I thought at the time, Jill was dating someone quite famous. And I thought, are they such a couple that they're now being like, well, they're out of the country. And I found out which country they were in. And the country was the other person, the other woman's country. And I thought, oh my God, they're like getting married. I literally did not understand what she meant when she said they. And I went from that to, then encountering this person who I fell in love with. And in my own defense, I will say that part of my issue has been what proved to be true, which is when Trump started running again this time, and the gender stuff was so central, even though everyone on both sides kept saying, why is this the big deal about this election? I mean, it was sort of immigration and gender. Every person of color in America is a rapist, and your kindergartner is going to have their gender changed at school in the cloakroom and then come home the other gender. And so my worry then was that, I don't know how to call it. I don't want to say the left, because I think this is sort of a new category, but I'll say the gender activists had not adapted well, I felt, to the mainstream thinking. And this was the whole problem. I mean, we could go for hours about the mistakes that the Democrats made in this election, but I was freaking out because the minute he started running and I saw this front and center, I said, we progressives have to change our language, and we have to talk to real people on this issue, and we have to counter these, fake truths about what gender meant. And sure enough, when he won, I had this whole resurgence of, they, them doesn't make sense and all this stuff. Meanwhile, of course, time has gone by. I'm more in love with this person who is a they, them. And I have witnessed firsthand more of what people who are not on the gender binary experience in their daily lives. I have more trans friends. I have more non-binary friends. And so the thing that interested me about doing the book was that most of the books I've written are when I find myself in a situation, as my mother used to say, including when I ran away from home at age 16 to join the hippie circus. She said, whatever the thing is, you're always in the middle of it. And this became another thing. And what I like about that is that I think as a writer, a memoirist, I feel like, I wrote a book about being a lesbian mother when lesbian mother was a new phrase. Like I learn the most from hearing people's real true stories, and not the pretty version, but the real version of what it is to be part of a demographic that is in the headlines. And so I am very much telling my story through now fiction, which makes it easier, of what it feels like inside me to confront the feminist in me, and also to have these political problems with the way gender activism has been represented. And, basically I'm answering the rejection letter that I got, 2 years ago, because I think she was right. I think that's really interesting.
Well, there's so many kind of remarkable things about how you reacted to this. It was really kind of a 2-round rejection. And I would love to maybe dig into that a little bit, because I know that writers listen to this podcast, and we've had authors on who've had this experience of writing an entire book. It gets rejected. And then it's just like, in some cases, like, I'm not going to be a writer anymore, or there's disillusionment, or a major resurgence of imposter syndrome for sure.
Yes.
But it sounds like you empowered yourself. You use these kind of as jet fuel. Is that more in the looking back? Can you tell us a little bit about the experience of the moment?
I have to say that if imposter syndrome was a big part of my reality, you would not be talking to me today, for sure. Yeah. I feel very lucky that because I became a writer truly in the first grade, getting published at age 6 is very helpful in dealing with imposter syndrome. And I still feel the thing that bothers me the most, has bothered me the most throughout my career as a writer, is the seductiveness of imposter syndrome. the seductiveness of believing that if you don't have the career you dream of, it's your own fault in some way, that it has to do with you're not being a good enough craftsperson, not being in the gestalt enough, not having your finger on the pulse, not knowing what's commercial, being with your head in the clouds, artist who just wants to sell their art. And it doesn't matter if people, care about Simone or Francois Sagan, like just, but don't you see what a beautiful story this is? I have been very commercially minded from the start. I think that really helps. The good news about that is that I think I do have a sense of what sells as much as anyone, because honestly, I work with so many publicists being a book reviewer, and I ask all of them on an annual basis today, what sells books? And it used to be Oprah's Book Club, the front page of People magazine, Fresh Air. Yeah. And now for the last at least 10 years, the answer has been, please let me know when you figure it out. Nobody knows. There have been so many surprise hits, so many surprise flops. And also the nature of publishing has changed so much that when I sold my first grown-up book, I wrote a book, the book I published when I was 19, with my boyfriend about being a hippie, and then a couple of other kind of activist little anthologies and stuff. But the first real book I published by myself as a semi-grown-up when I was 45 was What It's Like to Live Now with Bantam. And there was a bidding war. It was the first proposal I ever wrote. And it was 1992, I think. And there were 10 really big offers on the, I had that experience that people will talk about, not so frequently anymore. And I was flown to New York, and my agent said, I was saying, what should I do to convince them? And she said, no, you don't understand. They're trying to convince you. I have yet to hear anybody say anything to me besides I love you that means as much to me as those words. The whole concept that they wanted me as opposed to me trying to sell them. And I ended up having a really good experience with that book. But since then, it has been a total up and down road. That kind of set me up for believing that definitely I was a good writer. So that helped with the imposter syndrome. And also that I had my finger on the pulse, that I knew what would sell. And that was the book about being a lesbian mom. It wasn't really about being a lesbian mom, but it was about having 60s values in the 90s and what that looked like, and raising my kids with a woman, which was very new at the time to be public with. After that, Bantam gave me an even bigger contract for a second book that my mother and 3 friends bought copies of. And the Times pretty much trashed it. And, it was pretty much the classic sophomore experience. And then at some point, I think I might have written another book. I was kind of on a schedule in my mind of every year I'm just going to get another several $100,000 advance. And then I wrote a story for Salon magazine about publishing. You probably don't even know this, Liz, do you? And it was an expose of publishing, and it was very specific and not in my name. I used the pseudonym Jane Austen Doe, so I could say what I really wanted to say. I talked about and it was published maybe 1997 or 8 or maybe 2000. I can't remember, but it was about the racism. It was about the sexism, but it was mostly the real facts about the money. And by then my advances had gone from the highest to the lowest. And just to make sure I didn't have to worry about book advances anymore, I wrote a book that completely killed my career. I thought there was actually a contest. You remember Gawker? Gawker? Yeah. There was a contest in Gawker to figure out who had written this piece. And they thought it was Anne Lamott, who was a friend of mine. And I didn't want to do that to her. So, I empowered her to say it wasn't me. But my book editors all said to me, I knew it was you in the second sentence. And I said, how? And they said, because you always mention food in the second sentence of everything you write. And it's true. I feel that what people eat, when I used to do profiles, I would say, can I look in your fridge? Because people would say, oh, I'm all organic and I raise my kids with these ethics and open their fridge and find moldy Chinese food containers. People are so deluded about themselves, and looking in their fridge is a really good way, or saying what they actually eat.
Yeah.
Is they can't lie about it,
Right.
So anyway, sure enough, I had mentioned food. I have no idea why. And my career was completely shattered. My agent fired me. I couldn't get every publisher. By then I had been published by, I'd say probably 3 or 4 of the big, at that time, big 6. They said, you'll never, including Bantam, who had given me these 2 advances and told me, oh, we're here. I was like, why are you giving me so much money when you don't even know? I've never published a book. And they said, that's why, because do you have 10 books in you? We're here for the 10th book. Can you imagine someone saying that? And they were like, do not, and so my first agent fired me. I had to get another agent who took me on knowing that this had happened. And I did not publish a book or even get an in with, like, to talk to an editor for 5 years, which, it's not forever, but it seemed like it was going to be forever.
Sure.
And then what I had to do was start over. And the next book advance I got, I think, was $12,000. It was a big press, but it was a crappy press. And it remains my best-selling book, oddly enough. But anyway, I had to really get humble, and I wasn't on the tenure track anymore. I wasn't having what I call clitorary escorts meeting me at airports all over the world and asking me if I need any cigarettes or any whatever. That was not me. I was dirt in publishing. And at the same, I did not, je ne regrette rien. To this day, I will meet somebody and they'll tell me how they saw that story and they printed copies of that story. And when people would ask them, you're a famous writer, how come you're not rich? They would just hand them the story. It was something I do not regret doing, but my agent didn't like it. And so since then, I've been very up and down again, not nearly as up as I started. But and I've had some local bestsellers or regional bestsellers, but I think that's part of why I did Why We Write and why we write about ourselves, because I had such a hard time selling a book that was actually my book. So, and the last 2 books I have brought through proposal stage and my agent has gone out with have not sold. Which, people say, oh my God, you've published 14 books. Of course you're going to publish whatever you want. And I was like, no. It's kind of the opposite.
Yeah.
Especially since BookScan came along, and with a few, my agent used to lie. She would say, and when you go in for your meeting, tell them that this book sold 50,000 copies. And I said, it sold 20,000 copies. And she's like, they have no way to know that.
Now they do.
Whoops.
Yep. Well, it sounds like from all of this, you have, it's something that I greatly admire in artists, because, the market is sort of against you in a lot of ways. The framework of the industry is kind of against authors in a lot of ways. And yet you have really, it sounds like, leaned into being contrary at times, being a truth teller throughout, doing all of these things that artistically, feed your soul in beautiful ways, but commercially you're not doing yourself any favors, nor your agent, right? What for you? What has given you that kind of wherewithal to do that, really, to navigate your career that way?
Well, the answer is sort of in a slight correction I'll make. It wasn't really, my motive was never artistic. My motive was activist.
Well, right.
And
Yes.
yeah. So, and actually this artistic thing sort of, it did start to happen. Like that summer that I had 2 residencies at Yaddo and McDowell, which for those who don't know are very prestigious and competitive artist residencies. I used to go to all the, the lower level ones that were amazing and miraculous, but not as competitive to get into. And finally, after I'd been to those residencies a few times and I compared myself with other people, I saw that I actually was an artist as well as an activist. And I kind of gave myself a new challenge, which was to try to do both, which meant writing better, just working on my skill. And I actually took some classes, which I had never done. And now I would say well, you're asking what gave me the forward momentum, even when things were against me. Like for that whole 5 years that my agent basically said, you're just not going to sell another book. Like that's it.
Right.
And I built up my magazine career at that time. You know what a magazine is, children? A typewriter. So I started writing for magazines because they didn't care,
Yeah.
as long as I promised I wasn't going to expose the racism and classism in magazines. And so that's one coping mechanism that I have, is that when one door closes, I wiggle my way into another doorway. But the other thing is my activism. I've never been in this primarily to be an artist, to be proud of my craft. I've been in it. It's like I always say, I'm a plumber. The water's here. I want it to get to here. What do I need to learn to get the water to flow from here to here without leaking out onto the floor? And this is the idea that I have politically. For example, a book I wrote about class and race and education. This is the best-selling, the bestseller I've ever written. And my point of view was that if they abolished private schools, everything would be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
And if senators had to send their kids to public schools, everything would be fixed. So I wrote a whole book about that. And I did it by following 3 teenagers through their senior year in a very diverse high school. And that, for example, I remember very well thinking when I wrote that book, I want one sentence in here that I'm proud of from a craft point of view. One sentence. And I really worked on this one sentence. And my editor tried to take it out. Luckily, she was such a not editor that when I, put it somewhere else, she didn't notice. She misspelled my name on the cover until the very last proof. But anyway, so, at that point, it was one sentence per book because it felt like an indulgence to me relative to I'm writing this book to close the private schools. Mm-hmm. I'm writing this book to show how race and class impact drug treatment for teenagers or, whatever the lesson was that I wanted to teach. It was really more like that, to have people look at things from a completely different point of view.
Yeah.
And then I started noticing what influenced me. The books that influenced me, I realized were books that were really well written. Mm-hmm. So I would say, in answer to your question, I always knew I was a serviceable writer. I didn't care if I was a great writer. That was not my criteria. Were not my criteria. But then that changed. And so I think what's kept me going is setting a challenge for myself at all times. For example, you'll never write a book again. You'll never publish a book again. And so, how would I ever get to write a book again, even if they say no? Well, it would be to be known as a magazine writer and through magazine writing, come up with some idea that they just couldn't say no to. So I could do that, but I had a motive. I had the carrot and the stick working at the same time. And so, since I published my last book, which was, I don't even want to think about how many years it's been because it used to be so regular that I would publish a book. I have set myself the challenge of becoming an artist, activist, and working on my craft. And so this book so far, if it is ever to be a book, I mean, it is going to be a book, whether it ever gets in print is another thing. But I've already spent whatever that is, 2019, 6 years on this. And I'm not mad about it. I'm mad about it, but I'm not like not writing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is fascinating to me too, because just the mechanics of turning an existing memoir into a novel, the craft nerd in me and the artist in me is like how those are kind of two different animals. But from your point of view, you're coming from activism and journalism. And
Mm-hmm.
then with this kind of new added mission to be a craftsman, are
Mm-hmm.
you overhauling? Are you like saying, here's what I want to keep, but then I need to put a story arc? Like, how the hell are you changing one book
It
into
is
another?
so, we'll see if it sells, but for me, writing it, it's so much easier. Like I always said, why people would write novels and they'd say, how can you do journalism? It's so hard. You have to tell the
Mhm.
truth. You have to know things. And I always said, journalism is just telling what happened. It already happened. Like you don't have to make it up. When I wrote the one novel that I've been able to publish, I was like, how do you know how to make a plot? It just didn't make any sense to me. The plot is supplied in nonfiction. And
Mhm.
so I'm using the plot. I examined the plot of the nonfiction various versions, and I thought, what in here is really pointing toward the gender issue as opposed to just the arc of one woman's sexuality and how it matches up, how like I was being sexual when the pill was invented. So
Mhm.
how did that change my sexuality? I was going gay when going gay became a thing, that didn't get you killed all the
Right.
time.
Right.
There were many milestones in the culture that matched my own. And so really what the book was about was how the outer world affects the most inner world of a person and vice versa. As an
Mm.
activist, how your inner self moves you to change the outer world. So I cut out a lot of the big plot points that were in the memoir, or, that happen in life, in other
Mhm.
words. And I started the book where my agent said it starts, which is meeting my partner. And then I'm using my status as I always have, what is happening in my life that I can understand as few people can, but is about an issue that many people are talking about. For example, I am both an activist and for a long time have been not advocating a Republican point of view, but living a Republican point of view,
Mhm.
finding myself at the end of the pack instead of in the front of the pack, coming up the rear instead of being in the front lines and saying what's progressive on a purely emotional basis, not because I thought that, just because I couldn't handle saying they, them, or I couldn't handle having a partner who said, I'm not a woman. Well, so much of my identity was being a lesbian, and I can't really call myself a lesbian now. Those kinds of things. And I felt like, it's so hard for people like me and you to understand, why would people elect a president who said that their kindergarten children were going to be, transitioned to or be surgically
Yeah.
changed?
Yeah.
How could that happen? And I want to use my own backwardness, my own emotional response
Mhm.
to gender,
Mhm.
but as a progressive, so I can see where I want to end up. I don't want to be a Republican on the subject of gender, and yet there I was. So I'm using my own reticence, my own philosophy, my own made up excuses, my own discomfort, my own fears, my own identity issues to, in a way, speak to the people who say this has all gone too far.
Hmm. I just love your willingness to admit there were points of view that weren't necessarily in alignment with your,
Right,
your party of identification and your
right.
previous life experiences. And I wonder, was there some feelings of being, an imposter, both being queer in a relationship with someone who's non-binary, and then
Mhm.
also realizing that we're in this kind of election climate and
Yeah.
you aren't black and white thinking about every single issue.
This is why I love you, Liz. That was such a great segue back to the topic. And it's so relevant because we were talking more about imposter syndrome in terms of being a writer, but try this. I'm like known, not that I'm a household writer name, but I mean, in my books, and I am publishing a lot. I write for the Washington Post, the LA Times, and so on. And I take that very seriously. My editor, and two other people take that very seriously, but I do take it seriously, who I am in print. And then I'm like known for being this sort of persnickety critic I don't accept assignments for the most part. I pitch them books that I feel it's sort of the medium is the message. Like Black women were not getting reviewed when I started doing book reviews, and I used to have to fight with my editors. Well, I've never heard of her. Right, that's the point. Let's make sure people have heard of her. And so this thing about being known as kind of a fighter for progressive causes, and then knowing that my partner does not feel supported by me as a non-binary person, that I myself don't agree with my gut reactions to this, and yet I'm having those gut reactions. Talk about imposter syndrome. That's the kind of imposter syndrome where you're worried about getting caught.
Yeah.
It's not just here I am in public with all my makeup on, and here I am in private looking funky. It's like I need my inner world. I've written 6 memoirs, and I'm writing now what I'm calling autofiction, very much like, I hope, Miranda July's All Fours, which she bills as autofiction. And I know that a lot of the big things in her book are true of her. How do I do that and have any credibility? When I'm out of alignment, the only way my actions are out of alignment with my stated politics. I can only change. I can only change. I can't say, oh, well, it's okay to, vote for Kamala, but beat your wife, or JFK and MLK and all these guys who are complete pigs to their wives. Were heroes, unquestionable heroes, and that is still an acceptable. We just elected a president who's the biggest pig on men and women in the world. And I have always said, I am not going to support someone because their espoused politics agree with mine. I have to know what kind of person they are. And I'm not the kind of person I want to be on this subject. Wow. And just over this weekend, I read a big profile of Judith Butler. I don't know if you know who she is, but she wrote Gender Trouble. She's sort of she's academic, but she also has written 2 huge bestsellers about gender. And they themselves, I should say, have taken on the pronouns and so on. And in the New Yorker profile, Judith Butler said, I'm terrible about trans. I really need a lot of work. And I thought, thank you. Yeah. Can we just say we are not always where we want to be? And thereby leave room for regular people who are deciding Trump or Kamala, and they're thinking their kid's going to get an operation in kindergarten. Right. Can we just admit that we ourselves are thinking the left, the progressives, are going too far on some issues?
Yeah. Well, I think that's what you're saying is remarkable for a couple of reasons, because it's I think, directly antithetical to what's going on in politics right now. You're talking about self-accountability, direct communication, and also embracing community and looking out for people altruistically, which runs almost immediately and directly contrary to this idea of, exceptionalism, isolationism, and not really aggressively not questioning things and not taking in new information. So right. It's the way you're talking about it, that in and of itself, just the way you're approaching these things is unto itself like a real act of kind of resistance.
Yes. Thank you for seeing that. That's exactly, that's my modeling.
Yeah.
And as a 73-year-old activist, as much as I don't like being identified as old by other people, it's one of those things, I can say it, but you can't. What I feel is a new sense of responsibility, not to be too cheesy about it, but it's really true. Like I am totally counting on next generations to save this. And I'm thanking God and the universe that it's not my job as a 25-year-old, because it's going to be a hell of a job. So one of the things I feel is my responsibility as an activist is to model a way of living that I feel could actually carry us toward the light and not the darkness.
Yeah.
But you're right. All these confirmation hearings are, it's like if you took what I just said and took what they're doing, it's exactly the opposite thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was I really too drunk? Let's see. Oh, only 3 people had to carry me into the elevator, not 5. So I'm good,
Right.
you know.
Wow.
I want to change the course a little bit, because this is definitely something I would want to talk about for hours. But there's another kind of amazing career thing I think that's happened for you that is notable, and I think to talk about on the show would be great. And that is, you've recently gotten an option on one of your backlist titles, if I'm not mistaken. So I would
Correct.
love it if you could talk about that and kind of all aspects of what that's been like, and that you're out in LA, in Hollywood, and it's such a different industry, but maybe not that different. So I'd love to hear your experiences and insights.
Well, thanks. Yeah, just for factual, ironically, the title of the book is My Lie, a true story of false memory. So this is not my first rodeo of saying I was wrong between the covers of a book. And the book was published in 2010. And in the past few years, mysteriously to me, although I think I've started to figure it out now, all of a sudden I've been on a bunch of podcasts. I've been interviewed by book authors. People came from Paris to include me in a film they were doing. And it's all on the subject of recovered memory, or the issue of memory. And I was like, why now? Why, this book is, 15 years old. Why is this happening now? And my understanding for myself about it is exactly what we were just talking about. Like, lying has become, fake news, all that stuff has become such an issue, and people actually believing things, when you watch the interviews with the Trump voters beforehand, well, because no, actually that's not true. Now we're seeing what the truth is, but at the time, and you could see that people actually believed these unbelievable things. And I think that's part of why. So this became, of all the books on my backlist, this became the book. Another book for which I believe I was paid very little money and tried to sell a million places, and ended up publishing it with Wiley, which was ridiculous. I mean, it was, compared to all the other real publishers, it was just really, I hired my own publicist and all that, because I felt like this is an important subject at the time. Now it's become an even more important subject. So I have been getting a lot of requests, and there's been sort of energy around that book, to which I own the rights because the publisher folded, and thank God I thought to get the rights back for myself. And they actually sent me a PDF. So the only way that they burned all the books, they shredded the books. I can't say they burned, that's overly dramatic. They shredded the books. That's still pretty dramatic, because they didn't own a warehouse anymore. And like, all of a sudden I'm getting all this interest. I'm on all these, and I don't have anything to sell.
Wow.
So I took the PDF and I just started, I will email it to you for $15 or whatever, and my goal is not to keep the book secret. But anyway, and then of all these, there were a lot of things happening. And then this actually happened. And I knew when I met this woman, her name is Alison Murray. She's a Toronto filmmaker. She's an activist. She, interestingly, had a personal experience with the culture wars, that led her to be interested in making a film on the subject of memory and belief, and how people come to believe certain things. And so she got in touch, and we've been talking for maybe 6 months. These things don't happen overnight, even when it's not Netflix, it's not bureaucratic and all that stuff. It's just this person. And she's made some movies that I've seen and I really, really loved. And so I'm kind of having the experience of my dreams in a very contradictory way. This has been my dream from the start. And when I published my first adult book, Gina Davis it was a new thing that women actors who were well known would get their own production companies.
Mhm.
And Gina Davis wanted to option my first book, and I couldn't understand that at all. Nothing happened. A couple of the other books have been either optioned or close to optioned or whatever. Nothing made. And then when I met Allison, I thought, oh, I've been dreaming of, it would be the biggest of the big. And I would, the dream included me being on set and saying, no, because all my books are memoirs in some way or other. No, I would never wear those shoes. Change those shoes. That was my big thing. Like, I want to transform my characters, whether it's me or, someone else, I want them to stand up off the page and wear shoes and,
Right.
eat things, so everyone could tell it was me, right? Anyway, so she is an independent filmmaker. She optioned the book, and now she's going to have to sell it to Netflix or to someone big.
Yeah.
She wants it to be a 2-season episodic series, which is fine with me. And it's not going to be my story per se, which is really good because my family was not happy with this book. It caused a lot of damage. And so I think if I had been approached to option the book to reproduce the book, I probably would have said no if I had any sense. So she's going to turn it into a drama, it's going to be a thriller and but she's going to, and already is using me to sort of say, no, we would never use those words, or no, I would never wear those shoes. I would never eat a corn dog. So we're just starting. We just actually, as you know, signed the option a few days ago. And it's not a big money thing for me or for my agent. I want to shout out to my agent, my own Liz Parker at Verve. I signed with her years ago because Verve mostly does book to film. And I was thinking, oh, this is the easy way. I'll sell a book and then they'll make it into a film. And that hasn't happened for the whole first 5 years. But now, it seems to be, I really trust Allison, and that's a good thing. We have really juicy political conversations about what all this means. I'm not that interested in memory just for the sake of science. I'm not that into science, but I am interested in how did those Trump voters come to believe the things they came to believe? Well, I came to believe my father had molested me, along with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of other white upper middle class 30-year-olds at a certain moment in time, just like the Trumpers. So again, I'm using myself and my own frailties to explore what the hell is wrong with those people.
Well, if that's not I think, purest motivation to be a writer, to make sense of our own frailties, I don't know what is. And, I'm just really struck too by, the kind of agency and confidence you have around going into this book at this point in your life. It sounds like you were saying if it had been kind of a different spectrum of the book's representation at a different time, you would have said no, which makes perfect sense. But, I really love this idea of like a writer's career being a circular, shape as opposed to a line. And to go back to something you said earlier, which was really powerful, if a book doesn't get bought, it doesn't necessarily mean that the writer doesn't have the craft or the ability, nor do I think if a book doesn't succeed when it first comes out, does it not have the potential to get into the hands of the readers or the viewers that it should at a different point in time. So it's exciting to have you on, Meredith, because you have had this breadth of career that I don't think any of the other writers we've had on so far have. And it's really heartening to me because you've been in it. You've had some dips.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I'm not stopping. This book, I just sent it to my agent, and she might hate it or she might love it and know she can't sell it or not want to sell it for any number of reasons. It is not a very orthodox book, and it could or could not be a big hit commercially. I've already decided that the shame is off self-publishing now. I get books on my porch to review every day, and I'll say, oh, good, a new book by so-and-so. And then I'll see she basically published it herself.
Yeah.
And I think, what is happening? This has been going on for the last 5 to 10 years, where people I thought, just like people think of me, oh, you can sell any book you want and they all sell and everything's great and you're rich. And, you know, and I go through the same thing weekly, just looking through the galleys, like, why is this person not getting published by Random House anymore?
Right. Well, and I was wondering if you felt a certain opposition, if at all, to like hybrid or self-publishing, because I have talked to, I think, Greg, you as well, like especially at some of the writers' conventions and conferences, people are making the decision like, I'm going to hybrid publish because I want more agency or I want more say. And, you know, the kind of cachet that being published traditionally used to have is not quite there for the points you've mentioned. You know, the media space isn't there. It's
Right.
no one really knows how to hack a bestseller. You know, people are sending themselves on book tours. So it
Right.
makes sense, I think, if you've worked on a book and you want the world to receive it, but you want to have control over how they receive it, you know.
Yeah, it's not even for that reason. I would never, I mean, I'm just being honest. I'm not admiring myself for this, but I would always choose a big press, no matter what compromises I had to make, because I'm a realist.
Yeah.
And I've now had this experience of having basically 3 books in a row gone out for submission, which means it's already been vetted by a very smart agent in a very powerful agency. And the fact that those books did not sell makes me a realist about this. And it gives me the choice right in front of my face. Do you want to give up on this book? Or do you want to make any compromise necessary, including I don't even know what hybrid publishing is, but I'm going to go look it up when we get off here. You know, it really takes the ego out of it to some extent. I don't need the money. I'm on Social Security. Thank you. Thank you, socialists of the earlier days. You know, I can afford financially. I'm not supporting my kids like I was for most of my writing life. I'm very free to do what matters to me. And this subject, because of how much pain it has caused me and my loved ones, how much I have caused pain with my attitudes, it feels really important to me to get it out there. And if it sells 500 copies, that's only 7,500 copies less than the last one. So.
As we're kind of, you know, coming down the home stretch here, I just want to check in with your 6-year-old self. Are you still writing poetry? Are you still consuming poetry? Is that part of your, you know, your artistic life in some way?
That is such a great question, Greg, because I actually self-published at the Xerox store a book of poetry a long time ago, before I published any adult books. And, you know, I still look at it and I still think, I'm really glad I did that. And lately I've actually, since this artist category has gotten itself attached to me in some way, I've been thinking about that. Like almost every day I think of the beginning of a poem, because actually every book I've written starts with a poem, not necessarily a fully written out poem, but the skills that I needed to write poems are very much, it's kind of a roux of a book, you know, in the cooking term. And with the book, it's an elevator pitch, basically, if you want to use a more crass term. It's the emotion that is in me for it, because now I know what it takes to sustain writing a book. It's not like it used to be, where it would take me 9 months and it's out and I'm into the next one. I've been living with this one for a really long time. And so I know that I need a ton of emotion. I really need to care about talking to people about this subject. And I also need the understanding of what is the point. And because with a poem, you can't be all over the map. You've got 10 or 20 or 100 lines to make that point. And with a book, you can quite a bit and not get caught, you know, if you're not careful. So, or you have a crappy editor. Yes, I'm just in this revision of the book into a novel and sharpening the focus of the book from sexuality to gender. In a way, it's changing it from, I had to write a new poem to lead the book. one of my most wonderful editors, Dan Smetanka, who's at Counterpoint Press, he published my novel. And at the beginning, I don't know if he still does this. So sorry, folks, if you're working with Dan and he hasn't done this for you. And sorry, Dan, if I'm raising expectations. But he used to make a playlist. Remember CDs when you could burn a CD?
Yes.
He would make a CD. I was writing a novel with him and we were really revising it so much. It was almost like starting from scratch. I took a year off from making money to do it. And at the very beginning, he made me a playlist just from reading like the draft. And he did that for several of my friends who also worked with him. And he told me what the book was in the playlist.
Wow.
And I still listen to that playlist to inspire me because I remember the feeling I had when I listened to that CD. And I thought, oh, there is a way through this and out the other side, because he was just saying what you've got is, we got to start again. But the playlist was the story and it was so amazing. So that's kind of a poem in a way.
I love that. And I love the takeaway for people listening. If you're working on something and maybe you're feeling a little stuck or uninspired, make a playlist.
Yeah.
It's such a great motivator. And I want to hear this playlist.
I'll send it to you.
And I want you to come back for part 2 because that was a fast hour and it was such an incredible conversation. And there were things we didn't even get to. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, you guys. I had such a great time. I knew I would. It's wonderful. Wonderful thing that you're doing. I love it.
Thank you.
Thank you for lending us your time. It really has been a pleasure. And I will take us out. Thank you again. Also, before you do go, Meredith, tell people where they can kind of find you online, out in the world, etc.
Yes.
Well, my website is meredithmaran.com, meredithmaran.com. Everything's on there.
All right.
Thank you. And I apologize for mispronouncing your last name for the last decade plus.
It's on my website. It says asterisk rhymes with Sharon. It used to say rhymes with Karen, but God forbid.
Well, Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg is created and hosted by us, Elizabeth Keenan and Greg Wands. The show is produced and edited by Bookwild Collective founder Kate Harrogate, and Scott Leeds composed our original theme music, and Steve Luama designed our logo.
And you can find us on IG at Imposter Hour Podcast and online at imposterhour.com.